Welcome back to Focal Point AFR Talk. Brian Fisher is my name. Congenial, convivial, and amiable as always. You are listening to Focal Point, the home of muscular Christianity on conservative talk radio. One of the things we talk frequently about here on Focal Point is the importance of education and the importance of maintaining local control in education, the importance of parental involvement in education, the importance of parental choice in education, because we want the best for America's kids. We believe these decisions are best made at the local level. We believe that parents ought to have the choice, maximum number of choices to decide which educational options they think are best for their children. Now, one of the concerns we've expressed before here on this program is concern with these federal Common Core standards. And I'm honored to welcome to our decision maker line Sheri Few. Sheri is a candidate for the state superintendent of education in the state of South Carolina. And Sheri, am I saying it right? Is it Sheri or Sheri?
No, my name is Sheri. You said it right.
Okay, great, Sheri. I've got a good friend spells her name exactly the same, and she pronounces it Sheri. But Sheri, you have thrown your hat into the ring in South Carolina to run for state superintendent of education. I believe you got a major election coming up on June 10. But I want you to explain to our listeners, and I think it's encouraging for our listeners to know we've got people like you that are educated, parents that have had their kids in public education, that are alarmed at what's happening with Common Core, and are not just alarmed, but are actually doing something about it. So tell us, first of all, what raised your concerns about Common Core standards?
Well, I'm the president of a nonprofit organization called South Carolina Parents Involved in Education that I helped to found back in 2000. And we founded the organization based on concerns we had then about standards that were being recommended by our State Board of Education. At that time, they were health and safety education standards. And when we looked into the standards and the curriculum that was recommended with these standards, what we found was some really insidious, trashy curriculum content. So, that's how we got the organization started. And it was the work of parents all across our state, that stood up and said, we care about what's in our children's curriculum, and we're not going to stand for this. So we've been around for some time and been sort of a watchdog group in South Carolina. And we were approached by American Principals Project about a year ago, who's really led the way on this across the country on the scholarly information that they've produced on the problems with Common Core. So they asked if we'd be willing to help them. And to tell you the truth, at that time, I really didn't know about how bad the standards were. I'd followed education policy for about 15 years, and I was aware that the federal government had tried to force national standards time and time again. It started with outcome-based education, and then it was Goals 2000 and School to Work. So Common Core is really just the same effort of the federal government to try to take over education from the states. It's just repackaged and had a different name. So I looked into it, and the reason I wasn't aware is my children all attended and graduated from public schools, but now are out, so I really hadn't had the first-hand information. But once I learned and studied the issue myself, I created a PowerPoint and started traveling the state and trying to raise awareness among parents and other people that I'm associated with. And what I learned through these presentations is parents would show up at these meetings. And parents that weren't typically politically active, they were just concerned about what they were seeing with their children's homework, their children's attitudes towards school. And apparently the Common Core standards has just turned everything upside down in public education. And parents that would have never thought of leaving public schools are now exiting the public school system because Common Core is destroying public education. And I can give you some specific examples. The math standards, for example, they lower the amount of proficiencies a student learns so that a student no longer achieves pre-calculus or calculus in high school, which does not make them competitive for four-year colleges. But what's worse is they have reintroduced new math or fuzzy math of the 90s that was rejected. And they're teaching children these really bizarre algorithms for math, not the standard algorithms that you and I learn. And parents aren't even able to help their children with their math homework because they don't have a clue. And some of the examples that I've seen from parents are really nutty. And, you know, students that used to be math scholars and honors programs are now repeating an entire year of instruction because of the confusion and the problems with the math standards. Now, the English language arts standards also have a lot of problems. The biggest problem is they have replaced classics literature with what they call informational text. And quite often the recommended readings are laced with propaganda. But, you know, that's nothing new to public education. I knew when my children were in school, when I looked at the textbooks that they would bring home, that there was a definite liberal bias in the curriculum. And that's been almost 10 years now. But it has gotten far worse and doubles down with Common Core. An example of that in Appendix B of the ELA standards, they are teaching just the preamble and the First Amendment of the Constitution. And they don't give any, you know, background or setting information. And then they recommend that teachers have students read a modern author's perspective on the Constitution. And in that perspective, they say that our founding fathers were racist and bigots, and that's why the Constitution needs to be revisited. There's even some selections in Appendix B that are just frankly pornographic, really trashy information by modern authors. And so they're even abandoning, you know, the classics for modern authors in this attempt to teach children what they call informational text. So I don't mean to ramble on, but those are just a few examples. There are many, many more.
Well, you know, and I remember I played a soundbite here of a woman giving an example of how they were going to teach math in Common Core. And I agree with you. I've looked at some of the math problems that are in Common Core curriculum, and I cannot even understand the question. I don't know how a teacher would understand it. I don't know how a student would have any hope of being able to solve that problem. You know, my wife is a very gifted educator, taught for a number of years professionally. She couldn't understand the questions. And then another one where the teacher is explaining that 3 times 4, if a kid comes up with the answer 11, we'll give him credit for it as long as he can tell us how he got to 3 times 4 equals 11. There's another example that I was made aware of where they were, it was a section on Frankenstein, the classic work of literature. They didn't read any of Mary Shelley's book. They read some excerpts from the book. Then they read people talking about the book. And then the lesson that the teacher was supposed to bring to the students as application is that right-wing groups are all extremists and a danger to the government. That was where they were going with Frankenstein. So you see the kind of incredible kind of left-leaning bias in all of that. And Sheri, I'm talking here with Sheri Few, who's a candidate for State Superintendent of Education in South Carolina. Sheri, I'm sure you're familiar with this soundbite, but I want to play it again and have you respond to it. This is Melissa Harris Perry, MSNBC commentator. And again, I think this goes to the heart of the core issue. Who has the responsibility to make these educational decisions for children? I want you to listen to Melissa Harris Perry, very influential cultural commentator, and I want to get your reactions. Let's listen.
We have never invested as much in public education as we should have because we've always had kind of a private notion of children. Your kid is yours and totally your responsibility. We haven't had a very collective notion of these are our children. So part of it is we have to break through our kind of private idea that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to their families and recognize that kids belong to whole communities. Once it's everybody's responsibility and not just the households, then we start making better investment.
Sheri, give me your reaction to that.
Wow. You know, I have not heard that, and that just infuriates me. I mean, that is the height of the liberal attempts to control our families. It is unbelievable that anybody would even say that publicly and not have some sort of, you know, backlash. That's absurd. You know, but that's exactly the mentality of the public education system these days. You know, they want our children at younger ages, and they're tracking data on them now from preschool through 20 workforce. They want total control, and I believe it is an intentional agenda to indoctrinate our children so that they can change the form of government we have. And it's happening. And it should be no surprise when our adult children that we've raised as Christian conservatives, after they get out of college are rejecting their faith, and they believe in silly notions like man-made global warming because of the things that we have allowed our tax dollars to fund in public education. And you know, I'm sure there's plenty of parents who have adult children that can agree with me on this matter. I mean, we see it happening frequently. But for this woman to suggest that our children, our families, somehow belong to society and they know what's in the best interest of them is just absurd.
Well, you know, it seems to me that that's just a fundamental clash in worldviews, because if you read the scriptures and look at the orientation of the Word of God, it's very clear that children belong to parents. Parents have stewardship for these children. They have a responsibility to raise them in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. The responsibility to direct their moral training, their education rests squarely with parents. It's their responsibility to see that this gets done. And here we're running into the exact opposite of that, where children do not belong to parents. We, the cultural elites, we will take charge of your children. We know what's best. We know what they need to know, and we are going to instruct them on what we believe is a correct worldview, even if it clashes with the views that you yourself hold. You know, and Sheri, I'm looking at one piece, and then I'm going to let you go here, but one piece from the New York Times from yesterday morning, that there's even some backlash now from people on the left. Common Core is in trouble in a left-leaning state like New York, because parents and teachers alike are becoming very, very concerned about the testing, about the lack of clarity, about the lack of quality in the curriculum. And so this is starting to get resistance from a lot of different quarters, and you're leading the charge there in South Carolina. So, Sheri, you got about 30 seconds left. Anything, last message you want to leave with us about Common Core and what you want to do in South Carolina?
Well, I'd like to see my race for superintendent of education be a national referendum on Common Core. I think that everyone across the country needs to get behind my candidacy if they're interested in stopping this. And beyond stopping Common Core, one of the main things that I'm going to do once I'm elected superintendent of education that I think can set a precedent for the rest of the nation is I'm going to assemble a task force that reviews every textbook that's been adopted in South Carolina, and I'm going to have experts examine these textbooks, and we are going to reveal every bit of misinformation, things that aren't true, and things that are biased. If we can't have objective education, our tax dollars should not be paying.